Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, the only bedtime channel brave enough to take you to the exact moment civilization looked around, said, you know what, I'm done, and collectively packed its bags. Tonight, we're going back. Way back. Further back than your credit card debt. Further back than your worst relationship. Further back than the invention of pants. We're going to 1177 BC. The year the ancient world didn't just have a bad day. It had a bad century, and then the century had a stroke, and then somehow it got worse. But before we do that, if you enjoy what I do here, please like this video and subscribe. Only if you want to. Genuinely. No pressure. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. The algorithm tells me it's always somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. Which means either you have insomnia or you made a series of choices tonight that led you here. Both are valid. Both are relatable. Now dim those lights. Put a fan on. Get the good pillow out. Pull your blanket up. You earned this. You survived today. Which, as it turns out, is more than entire kingdoms could say in 1177 BC. Let's pause for a second before we begin. Have you ever had a day where everything just collapsed? Where you opened your email, saw 17 problems, fixed one, and accidentally created 24 more? Imagine that, but you're a Bronze Age empire. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to watch the entire interconnected global trading network you built over 300 years just evaporate? What do you do when your grain shipments stop arriving? When your palace burns down and nobody sends help? When your letters to allied kings go unanswered because, as it turns out, your allied kings also no longer exist? Did anyone see it coming? Did anyone send a strongly worded letter? Was there a meeting? Was there a committee? Did the committee also collapse? What does it feel like to be the last scribe in a dying palace, still dutifully writing down inventory records for oil jars, while the world outside the gate is on fire? And now, congratulations, you have just woken up in 1177 BC. You are somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. The air smells like smoke and cedarwood and something you really hope is a campfire. Your sandals are broken. 3 separate empires you've been trading with for your entire life have stopped responding to correspondence. There is a fleet of ships on the horizon and nobody is quite sure whose they are. The king is dictating letters. The letters are not being answered. You are alive, technically. Let's find out for how long. Before we watch everything fall apart, and it does fall apart spectacularly, in ways that historians are still arguing about today, you need to understand what was actually there to fall. Because 1177 BC didn't arrive into nothing. It arrived into something extraordinary. Something so interconnected, so sophisticated, so quietly impressive that when you learn what the Bronze Age world actually looked like at its height, your first reaction will be something like, wait, they had that? The Late Bronze Age, roughly the period between 1500 and 1200 BC, was, by any reasonable measure, the first genuine international world order. Not a metaphor. Not an exaggeration. A real, functioning, globe-spanning network of trade, diplomacy, correspondence, and mutual dependence that connected Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, Assyria, Babylon, Cyprus, and the Levant into something that looked, from the right angle, almost like globalization, almost like something you'd read about in a business school case study. Almost like something fragile enough that if you pulled the wrong thread, the whole thing would unravel. Spoiler, someone pulled the thread. You're standing right now at the peak of it, the absolute top of the mountain before the long fall. Picture a map of the eastern Mediterranean, and on that map, draw lines. Draw a line from Egypt to Cyprus. Copper. Draw a line from Cyprus to Greece. Bronze goods. Yet draw a line from the Aegean to Ugarit, pottery, wine, olive oil. Draw a line from Mesopotamia to the Levant, tin, textiles, grain. Draw lines everywhere. Cover the map in lines until it looks like someone spilled a bowl of spaghetti on it. That spaghetti is the Bronze Age economy, and it feeds everyone. Ships cross the Mediterranean carrying goods that no single region can produce on its own. Merchants know the routes. Scribes record the transactions. Diplomats carry letters between palaces written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, the ancient equivalent of English at an international conference, ensuring that the kings of a dozen different nations can argue about gold quality and the appropriate number of diplomatic brides without any fatal misunderstandings, most of the time. The cities are large by ancient standards. Ugarit on the Syrian coast has a population of somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people. Small by modern reckoning, but genuinely substantial for the 13th century BC. With a harbour full of ships, a scribal school, an international merchant quarter, and craftsmen producing goods that will turn up in excavations hundreds of miles away. The palace at Mycenae controls agricultural land, manages redistributive economies, and maintains military forces. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, carved into the Anatolian plateau, is a city of temples and archives and defensive walls so massive they still partly stand today. Egypt is Egypt, the eternal, the monumental, the relentlessly self-documenting civilization that has been building things that will last for millennia and then writing about how great those things are in hieroglyphics on the side of said things. It is, by the standards of its time, a golden age. Not golden in the fairy tale sense. There is slavery and warfare, and most people are farmers who never see a fraction of the luxury that moves along those trade routes. But golden in the sense of organised. Golden in the sense of functional. Golden in the sense of look what humans managed to build when they cooperated long enough. And that, of course, is why what comes next hurts so much. Because all of this, the ships, the scribes, the diplomatic letters, the carefully maintained trade routes, the palace economies humming along like a very complicated, very ancient machine, all of it is about to stop, not slowly, not gracefully, not with a committee meeting and an orderly transition plan. All at once, over the course of roughly 50 years, the Bronze Age world will simply cease to be. The cities will burn. The ships will stop coming, the letters will go unanswered, and the people who survive will spend the next 400 years trying to remember what it was like when the lights were on. Here is something nobody tells you about the Bronze Age. It was, at its core, a giant bureaucratic machine held together by clay tablets, olive oil, and the absolute faith that someone, somewhere, was keeping accurate records. The palace wasn't just where the king lived. The palace was the economy. It was the warehouse, the redistribution centre, the employer, the tax collector, the religious authority, and the HR department, all wrapped into one enormous mud brick complex staffed by scribes who wrote everything down on wet clay and then baked it into permanence, which is either very organised or the ancient equivalent of printing every email and filing it in a cabinet. The palace collected grain, wool, livestock, metals and labour from the surrounding countryside. It redistributed those resources to craftsmen, soldiers, religious personnel and workers. Everything flowed in, everything flowed out. The system worked as long as the inputs kept coming, which is to say, it worked fine right up until the moment it didn't. Let's walk through a day in the palace economy so you understand exactly what we're talking about. You wake up on a farm outside the palace city. You grow grain, not for yourself, or not only for yourself. A portion of that grain is owed to the palace, collected by palace officials who travel the countryside with their own clay tablets, recording every transaction. Your grain goes into the palace storerooms, which are large, cool, carefully managed, and represent the accumulated agricultural surplus of the entire surrounding region. Meanwhile, inside the palace, a craftsman is making bronze tools. He doesn't grow his own food, he's a specialist. The palace feeds him from the storerooms and supplies him with bronze from its own stockpile in exchange for his labour. A soldier is being provisioned for a campaign. A weaver is producing cloth that will be traded internationally. A scribe is recording all of it. Every jar of oil, every fleece, every bronze ration issued to every smith. The records are meticulous, the records are extraordinary. And the records are how we know any of this. This system, historians call it a redistributive palace economy, was in its way genuinely elegant. It solved the coordination problem of a pre-monetary economy. How do you get specialists to specialise when they can't feed themselves? You feed them from the central store. How do you fund military campaigns? You draw on the surplus. How do you maintain infrastructure? Palace labourers, fed from palace stores. Everything goes through the centre. The problem, and there is always a problem, there is always a thread, is that the whole system depends entirely on surplus, on there being enough coming in to cover everything going out, on the harvest being good, the trade routes being open, the tribute flowing reliably, the countryside remaining stable. Remove any one of those conditions and the machine starts to strain. Remove several of them simultaneously and the machine doesn't strain. It stops. There's also something else. The palace economy created dependence, deep, structural, civilization-wide dependence. The craftsmen couldn't feed themselves. The soldiers couldn't arm themselves. The merchants couldn't operate without palace backing. The scribes, obviously, couldn't do anything useful in a world where there were no more palaces. Everyone was connected to the centre. Everyone was sustained by the centre, which meant that when the centre failed, when the palace burned or the storerooms emptied, or the officials stopped coming, the people connected to it were not just inconvenienced. They were suddenly without the entire system that had organised their lives. Now, it is a lesson that has been learned and forgotten and relearned many times since. Complex systems are efficient right up until they aren't, and when they fail, they don't fail a little. In the late Bronze Age, the rulers of the great powers, Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, referred to each other in correspondence as brothers. This was not a term of genuine affection. This was diplomatic language, a formal acknowledgement that you were operating at the same tier of power and therefore entitled to a certain level of courtesy, including the courtesy of not being immediately invaded. The Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets discovered in Egypt in the 1880s, give us an astonishing window into what international diplomacy actually looked like. Kings wrote to each other constantly. They requested gold. They sent daughters as diplomatic wives. They complained in writing with extraordinary formality about not receiving enough gold. The king of Babylon once wrote to the pharaoh, and this is real, to express displeasure that the Egyptian diplomatic gifts had been inadequate, specifically that the gold sent was not pure and had been, upon testing, found wanting. International relations in the 14th century BC. Just two kings arguing about gold quality over clay tablet email. The system of brotherhood between great kings was not merely ceremonial. It was load-bearing. It held the international order together. If you were a brother king, you had certain rights and expectations. You could request aid in times of difficulty. You could expect your messengers to be treated with respect and returned promptly. And you could rely on a certain baseline of goodwill, or at least the performance of goodwill in your dealings. If you were not a brother king, you were a vassal, and your correspondence was deferential, and your options considerably more limited. The letters themselves are a remarkable document of what powerful men worried about across 3,000 years of distance. Gold, endlessly. Every king wanted more gold from Egypt because Egypt had it. The pharaoh distributed gold strategically, using it as diplomatic currency to maintain relationships. "Send me gold," the king of Mitanni wrote, in one of the more direct dispatches, for gold in your country is like dirt, which is not exactly subtle, but diplomacy was apparently more direct in the 14th century BC. They worried about messengers being detained too long at foreign courts. They worried about diplomatic gifts being insufficiently impressive. The king of Alashia, Cyprus, once complained that his messenger had been held in Egypt for 6 years. 6 years. The man had been sent on a diplomatic errand and had not come home for 6 years, and when he finally did, his king wrote a very firm letter about it. You can feel the exasperation across 3,000 years. They arranged marriages constantly. Sending daughters to foreign courts was standard diplomatic practice, a way of cementing alliances with something more durable than a promise. The pharaoh received foreign princesses from Mitanni, Babylon, the Hittites, and various Canaanite vassal states. He did not, however, send Egyptian princesses abroad, or so Egyptian sources claim. There's a letter from a foreign king explicitly asking for an Egyptian princess to marry, and the Egyptian response was essentially, "That is not something we do." The implication being that Egyptian royalty was too special to be given away, while foreign royalty was perfectly acceptable to receive. The diplomacy of asymmetric prestige, alive and well in 1300 BC. What held all of this together? The gold requests, the marriage negotiations, the complaints about detained messengers, was a shared understanding that the system was worth maintaining, that it was better to write the letter, even the irritated letter about impure gold, than to stop writing letters at all. Because when the letters stopped, and they did stop, at the end, everything that the letters had been holding together stopped with them. And now we arrive at the part of this story that every historian agrees on, and simultaneously nobody fully understands: the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are, without question, one of the great mysteries of the ancient world, a collection of groups who appear in Egyptian records beginning around 1200 BC, described as arriving by land and sea in massive numbers, destroying everything in their path, and bringing with them a level of chaos that makes your worst Monday morning look like a spa day. Egyptian sources describe them with dramatic flair, entire peoples uprooted and moving, destroying other lands, no country able to stand before them. Ramesses III fought them in a massive naval battle around 1175 BC and recorded his victory in extraordinary detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The carvings show ships, battles, prisoners. They are dramatic. They are impressive. They are also, historians now suspect, only part of the story, because the Sea Peoples alone don't quite explain what happened next. Let's start with who they were, or at least who Egyptians thought they were. Egyptian records name several distinct groups within the broader category of Sea Peoples: the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh. These names have been cautiously matched over a century of scholarship to various peoples of the ancient Mediterranean. The Peleset are almost certainly the Philistines. The Denian may be the Denans of Homer. The Shekelesh might be associated with Sicily. The identifications are plausible but not certain, because the Egyptians were not writing ethnography. They were writing victory inscriptions, and the distinction matters. Here is the honest truth about the Sea Peoples. We don't really know where they came from. We don't know if they were a coherent group with a shared identity, or simply what Egyptian scribes called everyone who arrived from the sea looking threatening. We don't know if they were invaders, refugees, migrants, raiders, or some combination of all of these things. We don't know whether they caused the Bronze Age collapse, or whether the Bronze Age collapse caused them, whether they were the flood that drowned the cities or the debris that the flood carried with it. What we do know is that something significant was moving across the eastern Mediterranean in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. The archaeological record shows destruction layers, burned cities, abandoned settlements at site after site across the Aegean and the Levant. Ugarit burned. Mycenae was damaged and then declined. Hattusa was abandoned. The palace at Pylos burned. Dozens of smaller sites show the same evidence: fire, abandonment, sometimes a gap of centuries before reoccupation. Was this all the Sea Peoples? Almost certainly not. Did the Sea Peoples contribute to it? Almost certainly yes. But the truth that emerges from a century of archaeology is more complicated and, in its way, more interesting than a simple story of mysterious invaders destroying everything in their path. The Bronze Age world was already stressed by drought, by famine, by internal tensions before the Sea Peoples arrived. The Sea Peoples may have been the shock that toppled a system already tottering at its foundations, or they may have been fellow sufferers of a collapse that was already underway, pushed by their own disasters into the territories of others. The mystery is genuine. The debate is ongoing. The burned cities are real. Of all the cities that disappeared in the collapse of 1200 BC, none has a more haunting final act than Ugarit, a thriving cosmopolitan port city on the coast of what is now Syria, one of the great trading hubs of the ancient world, a place where you could hear a dozen languages in a single marketplace and buy goods from as far away as Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean and Mesopotamia in a single afternoon. Ugarit was sophisticated. Ugarit was wealthy. Ugarit had a palace, a scribble school, an international merchant quarter, and a very active diplomatic correspondence with its neighbours. And then, only somewhere around 1200 BC, Ugarit stopped. The city was destroyed by fire, but what makes Ugarit extraordinary, what makes it one of the most haunting archaeological sites on Earth, is what was found inside. Archaeologists discovered a series of letters that were never sent, clay tablets, ready for dispatch, still in the kiln when the city burned, describing exactly what was happening as it happened. You are in Ugarit now. Let's put you there. You're a merchant, a prosperous one, by the standards of your time, which means you have a stone house near the harbour, a relationship with several trading partners in Cyprus, and a warehouse full of goods that have travelled extraordinary distances to reach your shelves. Your city has been prosperous for centuries. The harbour is usually full of ships. The market is usually noisy with negotiation. The Palace Scribal School produces administrators and a writing system. The Ugaritic alphabet, one of the earliest true alphabets in human history, that makes record-keeping faster and more efficient than the old cuneiform of Mesopotamia. You know, in the abstract, that things have not been right for a while. There have been letters from other cities about famine, about grain shortages, about unrest in distant regions. The merchant ships from some ports have been arriving less frequently. There have been rumours, always rumours in port cities about trouble on the open sea. Ships that set out and didn't return, routes that used to be safe that are no longer quite safe. But Ugarit has walls. Ugarit has a relationship with the Hittites to the north, the great empire that has been the guarantor of stability in this region for over a century. Ugarit pays tribute and receives protection. That is the arrangement. That is how it has always worked. Except the Hittites, as you will come to understand, have problems of their own. The letters you're waiting for from Hattusa are increasingly slow to arrive. The responses to your king's inquiries are increasingly vague. Something is wrong to the north, but the full shape of it has not yet come clear. And then things come clear very quickly. The harbour one morning is wrong. The ships on the horizon are not merchant ships. There is fire somewhere. You can smell it before you can see it. And the city that has stood for centuries, that has been a centre of trade and culture and cosmopolitan sophistication for longer than most civilizations have existed, has perhaps 3 more days. The scribes are still writing. The kiln is still hot. The letters are still being prepared for dispatch. The last letters of Ugarit read like a disaster unfolding in real time, and they are, despite being over 3,000 years old, completely comprehensible in the way that only genuine panic can be. One letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus describes enemy ships, 7 enemy ships spotted off the coast. Another asks urgently for grain because there is a famine and people are dying. A third letter from a Hittite official to the king of Ugarit is almost unbearably direct. It describes the enemy already in Ugarit's territory and instructs the king to act, to defend, to do something. There is a reply, or the beginning of a reply, in which the king of Ugarit explains that all his troops have been sent away, that his ships are gone, that he has nothing left to defend with. That letter was never finished. Or if it was finished, it was never sent. Or if it was sent, nobody answered. Let's read the letters together, as carefully as the distance of 3,000 years allows. The first letter is from the king of Ugarit. His name was Amurapi, to the king of Alashia, which is Cyprus. Amurapi is writing in a tone that starts formal and becomes, over the course of the letter, something rawer than diplomatic correspondence usually allows. He reports that enemy ships have been sighted, 7 of them. They have already done harm to his coastline. He asks for help. He asks urgently. The phrasing, in translation, has the quality of a man dictating quickly because there is not much time. The king of Alashia's reply survives. It is not reassuring. He tells Amurapi that he has his own problems, that his own towns have been destroyed, his own people killed. He cannot send help. He can only tell Ugarit to look to its own defences. It is the ancient equivalent of calling your neighbour for help during an emergency and hearing, "I'm also on fire, good luck." Then there is a letter from a Hittite official. The text describes the sender as someone in authority, perhaps the viceroy of Carchemish. And this letter is the one that stops you cold. He writes to Amurapi and tells him what the scouts have reported. The enemy has crossed into Ugarit's territory. The situation is serious. The king must act. He must not be slow. Organize your defences. Gather your forces. Do it now. Amurapi's reply begins. He explains that he has sent his chariots to support the Hittites elsewhere. He has sent his ships to support operations in a different theatre. The city is defenceless. The army is elsewhere. The fleet is elsewhere. This is the letter that was never sent or never answered, the final communication of a king explaining that by the time help could possibly arrive, help would no longer be necessary. The kiln baked the clay. The city burned. The baked clay survived in the ruins, which is one of history's minor accidental mercies, that the fire which destroyed Ugarit also preserved its last words. Archaeologists found the letters in the house of a diplomat named Rapanu, in what appears to have been his private archive. They found them in the palace. They found unfinished tablets, half-formed messages, correspondence that had been interrupted mid-sentence. The scribes were working when the end came. That is the detail that stays with you. The scribes were at their desks. They were doing their jobs. They were keeping records in a world that was about to stop needing any. The Hittites were, at their peak, one of the 2 superpowers of the ancient world, the other being Egypt, and for roughly 2 centuries they had been exactly what superpowers are. Powerful, territorial, occasionally terrifying, and very interested in making sure everyone knew it. The Hittite Empire stretched across most of Anatolia, modern Turkey, and at its greatest extent it had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, after which both sides declared victory. Neither side was entirely wrong, and the 2 empires signed what is generally considered the world's first surviving peace treaty. It was inscribed in cuneiform. Copies were sent to both capitals. Everyone was very serious about it. A copy hangs in the United Nations building in New York today, which is either inspiring or the most optimistic display in human history, given what happened to the Hittites approximately 100 years later. Because the Hittite Empire, the empire that fought Egypt to a standstill, The empire with the iron working advantage, the empire that ran one of the most sophisticated administrative systems in the ancient world, collapsed. Completely. And almost silently. The last known Hittite king is a man named Suppiluliuma II. He succeeded to the throne around 1207 BC under circumstances that were already difficult. He was the last of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. His predecessors had been fighting for years on multiple fronts. He left inscriptions describing naval battles in the waters off Cyprus, victories he claimed. Though the flavour of the inscriptions has the quality of a man writing emphatically about things that are going badly. He writes about building ships, about fighting enemies, about maintaining the empire, and then he stops writing, and so does everyone else. After Suppiluliuma II, there are no more Hittite kings, no succession crisis, no documented invasion, no record of a final battle. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, a city of temples and archives and massive defensive walls, was abandoned and then burned, or burned and then abandoned in a process archaeologists are still trying to reconstruct. The population of the city did not simply vanish. People left, probably in stages, probably over years, taking their portable possessions with them. The archives were not systematically removed. The city was not evacuated in an organised fashion. It was abandoned in the way things are abandoned when there is no longer any organising authority to manage a proper withdrawal. The Hittite administration, that extraordinarily sophisticated bureaucratic machine that had managed an empire spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles, simply ceased to function. The tablets stopped being written. The tribute stopped being collected. The roads stopped being maintained. The vassal states that had looked to Hattusa for protection, Ugarit among them, found themselves writing letters into silence. Some Hittites survived, obviously. There are successor states, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms of Syria and southeastern Anatolia, that carry fragments of Hittite culture and language into the first millennium BC. Carchemish, on the Euphrates, became a significant city-state that preserved certain Hittite traditions for centuries. But the empire, the thing itself, the great power that had faced down Egypt and signed the world's first peace treaty, was gone. Without a battle, without a monument to its ending, without a last stand that anyone recorded. It simply fell silent. And the silence, if you sit with it long enough, is louder than any battle inscription. Before ancient Greece was the thing you studied in school, before democracy and philosophy and the Olympics and all of that, it was something else entirely, something older and stranger and in many ways more impressive in the purely logistical sense. Mycenaean Greece. The Mycenaeans were the Bronze Age predecessors of classical Greek civilization, and they built things. They built enormous palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes and other centres, and these palaces were, by the standards of their time, genuinely sophisticated administrative centres. They had a writing system called Linear B, which was used almost exclusively for record keeping. Inventories of sheep, lists of workers, quantities of grain, records of bronze rations issued to smiths. It is, in other words, the world's oldest surviving accounting system. The Mycenaeans were not writing poetry on their clay tablets, they were writing spreadsheets, which either makes them more relatable or slightly disappointing, depending on your feelings about spreadsheets. The palace complexes were impressive beyond their administrative function. Mycenae itself, the city of the golden death masks, the city Homer would later call rich in gold, was built on a hill with walls so massive that later Greeks, coming upon them centuries after the collapse, assumed they must have been built by giants. They called them Cyclopean walls, after the mythical one-eyed giants of their own tradition, because no ordinary human force seemed capable of lifting stones that large. The stones were real. The Mycenaeans lifted them. No giants required, just organised labour, good engineering, and a palace economy that could direct both. Inside the palaces you find something unexpected. Luxury. The shaft graves of Mycenaeans, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s, contained extraordinary quantities of gold, masks, cups, jewellery, weapons inlaid with precious metals, objects that travelled from Egypt and the Near East to end up in the hands of Mycenaean rulers. These were people connected to the wider world, receiving its goods and producing their own for export. Pottery that turns up across the Mediterranean, olive oil in carefully made jars that archaeologists find from Egypt to the Levant to Italy. The Mycenaeans were also apparently militaristic, in a way that the later classical Greeks would mythologize. The Linear B tablets record chariot wheels, bronze armour, swords and spears in palace storerooms. The palaces themselves are fortified. And as the ruling class that built the shaft graves was buried with weapons as a matter of course. This was a warrior aristocracy, one that also happened to maintain extremely detailed administrative records about the quantity of wool its sheep were producing. And then, slowly, then quickly, as the saying goes, it ended. The palace at Mycenae was damaged around 1200 BC and seems to have declined afterward. The palace at Tiryns was partially rebuilt but also reduced. The palace at Pylos burned around 1180 BC and was never reoccupied. The Linear B writing system disappears from the record. The long-distance trade that had brought luxury goods from across the Mediterranean dried up. Population declined. The elaborate palace administration collapsed. What was left was smaller, simpler, and cut off from the wider world in ways that would take centuries to undo. The Mycenaeans had built something remarkable, and like everything remarkable in this story, they had built it just in time to lose it. Of all the Mycenaean palaces that fell during the Bronze Age collapse, Pylos is the one that breaks historians' hearts a little. Because Pylos, unlike some of the others, left behind an extraordinarily detailed record of its final days. The palace at Pylos, sometimes called the Palace of Nestor, after the Homeric king associated with the region, was destroyed by fire around 1180 BC, and the fire that destroyed it also accidentally preserved the thousands of Linear B tablets inside, baking the clay hard the way a kiln would have, which means we can read them, and when you read them, something remarkable emerges. The people of Pylos knew something was coming. The tablets from Pylos's final period record an unusual mobilization, rowers being assembled, watchers being posted along the coast, land being redistributed in ways that suggest emergency measures. The palace was preparing for something. It just didn't survive it. The tablets are meticulous. The palace burned anyway. The bureaucrats did their jobs right up until the end. Let's spend some time in Pylos in its final months, because the picture those tablets paint is one of the most vivid and melancholy in all of ancient history. The palace administrative system is still functioning. Scribes are still at work. The records are still being kept with the care and precision that characterises Mycenaean bureaucracy at its most organised. But the content of the records has changed. There are tablets recording the dispatch of rowers, hundreds of them, to specific coastal locations. This is unusual. Naval mobilisation of this scale, documented in this way, suggests something more than routine coastal patrol. The rowers are being sent to watch, to be ready. There is a threat coming from the sea, and the palace knows it. There are tablets recording the redistribution of bronze. Normally, bronze was carefully managed, issued to smiths, collected back as finished goods, tracked at every stage. But in the final period, bronze is being collected from a wider range of sources, including bronze vessels from sanctuaries. Sacred objects are being melted down for weapons. When a Bronze Age palace starts raiding its own temples for metal, the situation is not good. There are tablets recording the assignment of watchers to the coast, specific individuals, at specific locations, presumably with specific instructions about what to do when they see what they're being sent to look for. The coastline of Pylos is rugged, with many places a fleet could approach. The palace is trying to cover as much of it as possible with the people it has, and then the tablets stop, not with a final dramatic entry, not with a scribe writing their here in careful syllabic script. They just stop, in the middle of the administrative cycle, in the middle of the day. The fire came, the roof collapsed, the archive burned, and in burning was preserved. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 1930s and after, they found the tablets in the ruins of the room where they'd been stored, blackened by the fire, baked hard, legible. 3,200 years later, you can read what Pylos was worried about in its last days. You can count the rowers. You can trace the movement of bronze from sanctuary to smithy. You can see the watchers being posted on the cliffs above the sea. You can see a palace trying, with bureaucratic diligence, to organise a defence against something that ultimately could not be organised against. The palace burned. The records survived. The watchers on the coast saw what they were sent to see, and after that nobody wrote it down. Egypt outlasted almost everyone else in the Bronze Age collapse, and the reason for that is largely one man. Ramesses III, a pharaoh who seems to have understood, with unusual clarity, that everything was on fire and someone needed to do something about it. Ramesses III came to the throne around 1184 BC, at exactly the wrong time. The great Hittite empire to his north had already collapsed. Ugarit was gone or going. The Levantine coast was in chaos, and the sea peoples, those mysterious waves of migrants and raiders, were moving south with an apparent intention to settle, permanently, in territory that Egypt considered its sphere of influence. Ramesses met them in not one but two massive engagements, a land battle and a naval battle, both of which he recorded on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, with the kind of detail that suggests he was very aware that future historians would be studying these walls, and he wanted to make sure they got the story right, which is either admirable foresight or the world's oldest example of controlling the historical narrative. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu are remarkable documents. They describe the sea peoples in vivid, somewhat terrifying terms, confederacies of people, the records say, from the islands and the northern lands, moving like a flood across the earth, destroying kingdoms as they went. No land could stand before them. The Hittites had fallen. The kingdoms of the Levant had been swept away. Egypt was, in the Egyptian account, the last thing standing between these unstoppable forces and the end of civilization as it was known. Whether this framing is entirely accurate is debatable. Egyptian royal inscriptions are not notable for their modesty, but the underlying situation was real. There was a massive influx of people moving toward Egypt's northern borders, arriving both overland through the Sinai and by sea along the coast. They were bringing their families and their possessions. This was not a raid. This was a migration, and migrations are harder to fight than armies because they do not stop when you defeat their vanguard. Ramesses prepared. He stationed troops along the Nile Delta. He assembled a fleet. Egyptian naval power was not historically Egypt's strongest suit, but Ramesses appears to have made significant investments in it. He chose his ground carefully, positioning his naval forces in the confined waters of a Nile mouth, where the manoeuvrability advantage of the sea people's ships would be reduced. The battle, when it came, was apparently decisive, at least in Egypt's favour. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show Egyptian soldiers using long poles to capsize enemy vessels, archers firing from both ships and shore into the water where the enemy floundered. Prisoners are depicted in considerable numbers. The Egyptian fleet, fighting in waters it knew against an enemy operating at the end of long supply lines, won. But here is the part that the Medinet Habu inscriptions are less emphatic about. Winning the battle did not restore the world. Egypt survived. Egypt was not conquered, but the Egypt of Ramesses III was already poorer, already more pressured, already more internally fragile than the Egypt of his great predecessor, Ramesses II, a century earlier. The Levantine Empire, the buffer zone of client states and tribute-paying city-states that had made Egypt wealthy and secure for centuries, was gone. The trade networks were disrupted. The grain was harder to come by. The treasury was under strain. Ramesses spent the rest of his reign managing decline with impressive energy. He fought. He built. He inscribed his victories on stone in letters large enough to be read from a distance. He maintained the rituals and the records and the appearance of Egyptian permanence, and then he was assassinated by members of his own court in what is called the Harem Conspiracy, which tells you something about how well things were actually going behind the monumental facade. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse. It just couldn't quite survive intact. For a long time, historians looking at the Bronze Age collapse focused primarily on the violence, the sea peoples, the raids, the burned palaces. But over the past few decades, another explanation has emerged from the data, quieter, slower, and in some ways more terrifying than any army: the drought. Pollen records, sediment cores, and ancient climate data now suggest that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged period of drought and reduced rainfall beginning around 1200 BC and lasting, in some regions, for up to 300 years. Not a single bad harvest, not a single dry summer. A systematic multi-decade reduction in rainfall across exactly the region where the Bronze Age civilizations were concentrated. For palace economies that depended on agricultural surplus, on grain collected, stored and redistributed, a prolonged drought wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. The letters from the period say it plainly: there is no grain. People are dying of hunger. Send food. The food didn't come. Let's talk about what drought actually means in the ancient world, because it does not mean what drought means to you. When you hear drought today, you think of water restrictions and brown lawns and maybe a summer that feels unusually miserable. You do not think of civilizational collapse. But you also live in a world with global food supply chains, refrigeration, synthetic fertilizers, and the ability to move food from where it is to where it isn't with a logistics network that would be completely incomprehensible to a Bronze Age palace administrator. The Bronze Age world had none of that. The Bronze Age world had what it grew, where it grew it, stored in the palace storerooms for as long as the grain kept without rotting. A bad harvest meant less in the storerooms. 2 bad harvests meant the storerooms were running low. 3 bad harvests meant people were hungry. 5 bad harvests, and the pollen data suggests the drought lasted much longer than 5 years, meant something that no palace economy had a contingency plan for. The science behind the drought theory has strengthened considerably over the past 2 decades. Pollen cores taken from lake beds in the eastern Mediterranean show a sharp decline in tree pollen, oak, olive, pine, beginning around 1200 BC and continuing for centuries. Trees are slow to die and slow to recover, which means a reduction in tree pollen represents a sustained change in conditions, not a single bad year. Sediment cores from the same region show evidence of increased dust and erosion, he says, what you get when vegetation cover declines and the topsoil starts to go with it. Isotope analysis of ancient stalagmites from caves in the region shows a clear shift toward drier conditions beginning in the late 13th century BC. Now add this to the palace economy problem you already understand. The palace economy worked by collecting surplus. A drought doesn't just reduce the harvest, it reduces the surplus. And when there is no surplus, the palace has nothing to redistribute. The craftsmen go unfed, the soldiers go unsupplied. The scribes are still writing, they are always still writing, right up until they aren't. But the numbers they are recording have stopped making sense. The storerooms are emptier than the tablets say they should be. The tribute from the countryside is arriving short. The requests for grain aid from neighbouring kingdoms are impossible to fill because you have no grain to send. And then the neighbouring kingdom stops sending requests, which means one of two things. Either they found grain somewhere else, or they stopped existing. The drought didn't burn the palaces, it didn't raid the coastlines, it didn't march armies through the countryside. It just quietly, persistently, over the course of decades, removed the agricultural foundation that the entire Bronze Age world was standing on, and then it waited to see what would fall first. Everything fell first. You know things are bad when the official diplomatic correspondence between kingdoms consists primarily of one word, repeated in increasingly desperate variations: grain. The late Bronze Age correspondence from the final decades before the collapse is, if you read enough of it, a sustained multinational cry for food. The Hittite king wrote to the pharaoh asking for grain because, as he put it, his country was dying. The Ugaritic letters mention famine multiple times. The Egyptians themselves recorded grain shortages. A letter from a Hittite official describes the situation with a directness that is almost modern. It is a matter of life and death, he wrote, and the phrase lands across 3,000 years with exactly the weight it was intended to carry. When the agricultural system that underpins a palace economy fails, when the grain stops coming in, everything else follows. You cannot pay workers without grain. You cannot maintain armies without grain. You cannot hold an empire together when your people are hungry. And you cannot ask hungry people to be patient while the diplomatic letters go unanswered. Let's sit with one of these letters for a moment. A Hittite king, the scholars believe it was Tudela IV, or one of his immediate successors, wrote to the pharaoh of Egypt with a request that must have been extraordinarily difficult to make. The Hittites were a superpower. They had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh. They had signed the world's first peace treaty as equals. They referred to each other as brothers. And now the Hittite king was writing to say, "Please send grain. It is urgent. My country is in danger. It is a matter of life and death." He used those words. He was not being poetic. The Egyptian response, if there was one, is not preserved. But we know from other records that Egypt did send grain shipments northward during this period, grain transported by ship to Hittite-controlled ports. It was not charity exactly. It was the operation of a mutual aid system that the great kings had been maintaining for decades, the practical underpinning of all the diplomatic brotherhood. You scratch my back. I send you grain when your harvests fail. The system worked when the failures were temporary and regional. It was not designed for simultaneous multi-kingdom, multi-decade failure. Because here is the thing about sending grain to a kingdom in crisis. You have to have grain to send. And Egypt, by the reign of Ramesses III, was itself experiencing supply pressures. There are records from the reign of Ramesses III, documenting grain ration failures for the workers at Deir el-Medina, the village of the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These workers went on strike when their grain rations did not arrive on time. It is, historians note with some satisfaction, the earliest recorded labour strike in human history. Workers in ancient Egypt, 1170 BC, downed tools and demanded their pay. The grain was late. They were hungry. They were not going to pretend otherwise. Even in Egypt, even in the kingdom that outlasted everyone else, the system was straining. Famine works slowly and then fast. First, the stored grain depletes. Then the livestock, the animals you would have bred for future production, get eaten because there is nothing else. Then the seed grain is the grain you set aside to plant next season's crop, gets eaten, which means next season there is no crop. By that point, the famine is no longer a food shortage. It is a trap. Every decision to survive today makes survival next year harder. Palace administrators, faced with these choices, had no good options. They could distribute the remaining grain and watch the storerooms empty. They could ration strictly and watch the population weaken. They could request grain from neighbours who had none. And they could write letters, careful, formal, desperately urgent letters, and wait to see if anyone answered. Here is the part of the Bronze Age collapse that feels almost uncomfortably modern. The very things that made the Bronze Age world so sophisticated, its complexity, its interconnectedness, its mutual dependence, knew also the things that made it catastrophically fragile. Bronze, the metal that defined the entire era and gave it its name, required two components: copper and tin. Neither was universally available. Cyprus was a major source of copper. Tin came from much further away, from Afghanistan, possibly from Britain, through long overland and maritime trade routes that stretched across thousands of miles. To make bronze, you needed a supply chain. To maintain a supply chain, you needed stable trade routes. To maintain stable trade routes, you needed political stability across multiple kingdoms. To maintain political stability, you needed agricultural surplus to feed populations and armies. To maintain agricultural surplus, you needed rain. Do you see where this is going? The Bronze Age world was a system, and systems, when they become complex enough, don't just have problems, they have cascades. Think about what bronze actually meant to the Bronze Age world. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't optional. Bronze was the material basis of military power, of agricultural tools, of the craftsman's workshop. A palace without bronze could not arm its soldiers. Soldiers without weapons could not protect the trade routes. Trade routes without protection could not deliver tin to the smiths. Smiths without tin could not make bronze. The circle closed on itself with a completeness that was elegant in good times and catastrophic in bad ones. Now imagine a disruption anywhere in that circle. A drought reduces agricultural surplus, which reduces the resources available to maintain the military patrols that keep the trade routes safe. The trade routes become more dangerous. Merchants make the calculation that the risk is no longer worth the profit. Tin shipments become irregular, then rare, then absent. The palace smiths, with less tin, produce less bronze. With less bronze, the military is less equipped. With a less equipped military, the trade routes are even less safe. The disruption feeds itself, grows, and within a few years something that started as a regional agricultural problem has propagated through the entire system to produce a military and economic crisis that looks from the outside like an invasion or a collapse, because by that point it is both. Modern complexity theorists have a name for this: cascading failure. It's the same mechanism by which a single overloaded electrical node can black out an entire continent, or a single bank failure can become a global financial crisis. The Bronze Age had no complexity theorists, but it had apparently all of the complexity. There is something else the system's complexity produced that made the collapse worse: an inability to adapt. Palace economies were optimized. Every piece of the system had a function. Every function depended on the others. This optimization made the system efficient under normal conditions and brittle under abnormal ones. There was very little redundancy, very little slack built into the system to absorb shocks. The Mycenaean palace at Pylos, mobilizing rowers and melting sacred bronze vessels in its final months, was not adapting. It was consuming its own reserves because there was nothing else to do. When you have spent centuries optimizing for a particular set of conditions, and you have also spent centuries losing the capacity to function under different ones. The collapse in this light was not just a military or agricultural or climatic disaster, it was an architectural one. The Bronze Age world was built in a way that made it extraordinarily productive until the moment it became extraordinarily vulnerable, and then, when several vulnerabilities arrived at once, the architecture that was supported everything became the mechanism of everything's undoing. There is something quietly magnificent about the scribes of the Late Bronze Age, the people whose job it was to write everything down, to record every transaction, every diplomatic exchange, every inventory of oil jars and sheep and bronze rations, right up until the moment there was nothing left to write about and possibly no palace left to write in. Ancient scribes in the Bronze Age palace system were specialists. They trained for years. They learned cuneiform or Linear B or the Ugaritic alphabet, because Ugarit, impressively, had developed one of the earliest alphabets in history, and they spent their working lives in the palace records rooms, maintaining the administrative machinery that kept the whole system running. They were not warriors. They were not farmers. They were the ancient equivalent of middle management, which means they were simultaneously essential and entirely dependent on the system around them for their own survival. When the palaces fell, the scribes fell with them, and with the scribes went the writing systems. Linear B disappears from the archaeological record after the collapse. It would not be replaced for 400 years. Training to be a scribe in the Bronze Age was not a casual undertaking. At the scribal school at Ugarit, the Aduba, to use the Sumerian term that was borrowed across the ancient Near East, students spent years learning their writing system, copying texts, practicing the formation of signs on wet clay until the movements became automatic. They learned the sign lists, the ordered, standardized inventories of symbols that form the backbone of cuneiform literacy. They copied literary texts, administrative formulas, the diplomatic phrases that would appear in royal correspondence. They learned Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, alongside their own native tongue, making them, by the standards of their time, genuinely multilingual. And what did they produce? They produced records, inventory after inventory after inventory. Jars of oil, 42. Sheep, 612. Bronze allocated to the smith are something we can't quite read. 8 talents. Grain received from the village of somewhere, 300 measures. The tablets are specific, precise, and completely unsentimental. They were not writing for posterity. They were writing because the palace needed to know how many jars of oil it had. The fact that they were writing for posterity anyway, that the baked clay survived when everything else was ash, is an accident that the scribes themselves could not have anticipated and would probably have found baffling. There is a particular tablet from Pylos, unearthed in the palace ruins, baked hard by the same fire that destroyed the building, that records a perfectly ordinary transaction. It lists quantities of some commodity, assigned to some recipients in the standard administrative format. It is the same kind of tablet that Mycenaean scribes had been producing for centuries. It was probably written days, possibly hours before the palace burned. The scribe who wrote it had no way of knowing it would be the last record of its kind for 4 centuries, that the writing system it employed would die with the building, that the next person to read it would be a 20th century archaeologist who had to spend years deciphering a script that no living person remembered. He just wrote it down. He did his job. The palace burned, and his work survived, and that is all any of us can really hope for from the records we keep. And this is where the story gets genuinely eerie. After the Bronze Age collapse, after the palaces burned and the trade networks dissolved and the scribes stopped writing, there is a gap, a long gap. Historians call it the Greek Dark Ages, and it lasted from roughly 1150 to 800 BC, approximately 350 years during which the population of Greece dropped dramatically. Long-distance trade essentially ceased, writing disappeared, monumental architecture stopped being built, and the sophisticated palace-centered society of the Mycenaeans was replaced by something much simpler, much smaller, and much harder to document because nobody was writing anything down. 350 years. That is longer than the entire history of the United States. That is longer than the gap between Shakespeare and today. That is long enough that by the time Greek civilization re-emerged into the historical record in the 8th century BC, the people living in Greece had essentially no memory of what had come before. No accurate memory anyway. They had myths. They had Homer. They had stories of heroes and palaces and great wars that seemed almost too grand to be true. The word dark in Greek Dark Ages does not mean evil or violent, though it was probably both of those things at various points. It means dark in the archival sense. Dark because we cannot see it clearly. The lights of the administrative record went out with the palaces, and for 350 years we are largely navigating by the dim light of archaeology alone. What the archaeology tells us is sobering. Population estimates for mainland Greece during the Dark Ages suggest a decline of somewhere between 50 and 75% compared to the late Bronze Age peak. This is not a rounding error. This is a demographic catastrophe on a scale that is difficult to conceptualize. Think of the landscape, the towns, the farmland, the roads, the density of human habitation, and then remove 3/4 of the people. The villages that remain are smaller, the fields are fewer, the sheep and cattle are less numerous. The market where people traded goods from distant places is gone, because the distant places have also lost 3/4 of their people, and nobody's making the goods anymore. The settlements that survive are simpler. The Mycenaean palaces were large, complex, multi-story structures with drainage systems and storage magazines and fresco-painted walls. What replaces them, in the archaeological record of the Dark Ages, are small oval huts with beaten earth floors. Not because the people who built them were stupid, because the social and economic organisation required to build a palace no longer existed, and the simpler structure was what was achievable with the resources and labour available. Long-distance trade, the maritime network that had moved copper from Cyprus and tin from Afghanistan and oil from Greece and textiles from Egypt, essentially ceased. The material evidence is clear. The distinctive pottery styles that archaeologists use to track trade connections between regions appear only locally during the Dark Ages. Things stop moving, people stop moving, or move less, or move differently. The world contracts to the village, the valley, the local horizon, and the silence ultimately is the most telling thing. 350 years of human life and suffering and small triumphs and ordinary days, and almost none of it written down. Because nobody remembered how to write. Speaking of Homer, and we have to, because this is where it gets strange and wonderful, the Iliad and the Odyssey, composed somewhere in the 8th or 7th century BC, are now understood by many scholars to be, among other things, a kind of distorted memory of the Bronze Age world. The heroes are Bronze Age heroes. The warfare is Bronze Age warfare. Chariots, bronze weapons, palatial cities. Troy, ancient Wilusa located in northwestern Anatolia, was a real city, and it was destroyed by fire more than once. In the general period of the Bronze Age collapse, whether there was a war over a woman named Helen is, archaeologically speaking, somewhat unlikely to be verifiable. Whether there was a significant conflict in that region during the period when the Bronze Age world was unravelling, that is considerably more plausible. What Homer preserved, without knowing it, was a kind of collective cultural memory of a world that had existed and then vanished, transmitted orally through the Dark Ages, elaborated and mythologized, until it emerged on the other side as epic poetry. It is the longest game of telephone in human history. Troy is real. Let's establish that first, because it matters. The site of ancient Troy, called Hisarlik in modern Turkey, a low mound on the plain near the mouth of the Hellespont, it was excavated beginning in the 1870s by Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman with an obsessive belief that the Iliad was history rather than myth, and enough personal wealth to dig until he proved it. He was right that Troy was real, though wrong about almost everything else. He misidentified the layers, destroyed important evidence in his enthusiasm, and declared a cache of Bronze Age jewellery to be the treasure of Priam, which it almost certainly was not. Subsequent excavations, more careful and more systematic, have identified at least 9 major phases of occupation at Hisarlik, stretching from the early Bronze Age to the Roman period. The phase that interests us is called Troy VI or Troy VII. The debate between these two candidates is ongoing and technical and need not detain us. What matters is that there was a significant, walled, prosperous city at this location during the late Bronze Age, a city with large buildings and storage facilities and connections to the wider Bronze Age trading world, a city that was destroyed. The question of whether it was destroyed in a war, by an earthquake, by fire from within, or by some combination of these things is exactly the kind of question that archaeology is very good at asking and sometimes very bad at answering. What Homer did, or what the tradition that culminated in Homer did, over 350 years of oral transmission, was take whatever actually happened at Troy, combine it with the general catastrophe of the Bronze Age collapse, a blend in the figures of real Bronze Age warriors whose names and deeds had been preserved in song and story through the Dark Ages, and produce something that was simultaneously true and fictional. True in the emotional and cultural sense, it captured the heroic ethos of a warrior aristocracy, the grief of war, the longing for home, and fictional in the specific details, which had been elaborated and mythologized beyond any possible verification. The Trojan War, as Homer tells it, probably did not happen exactly as described. The face that launched 1,000 ships was probably not Helen. The wooden horse was probably not wooden. But something happened at Troy, in the ruins of a Bronze Age world, and people remembered it for 350 years without writing it down. That, if you think about it, is its own kind of miracle. When Ugarit burned, the city was finished, but the people, or at least some of the people, were not. One of the questions the Bronze Age collapse forces us to ask is, when a palace falls, what happens to everyone who lived under it? The short answer is, it depends. Some fled, some were killed, some were captured and enslaved, some were absorbed into neighbouring communities, some became refugees, and the sea peoples themselves may have partly been refugees, populations displaced by earlier collapses further north and west, moving south and east in search of somewhere stable to land. The collapse was not a single event with a clear before and after. It was a rolling catastrophe that moved across the eastern Mediterranean over decades, hitting different regions at different times with different levels of severity. Some cities recovered, and some did not. Some populations dwindled but persisted. Others vanished so thoroughly that it took 3,000 years of archaeology to even confirm they had existed. Let's think about the individual people of Ugarit, because it is too easy to talk about collapse in the abstract, in the language of systems and trade networks and palace economies, and forget that these were human beings with houses and families and a warehouse full of traded goods and a very reasonable expectation. One morning, that today would be more or less like yesterday. The merchant class of Ugarit was internationally connected in ways that were unusual even by Bronze Age standards. We know from the archives that Ugaritic merchants had commercial partnerships with counterparts in Cyprus, in Egypt, in the Aegean, in Mesopotamia. They operated under legal frameworks. There are tablets recording commercial disputes, contracts, debts, the resolution of disagreements between merchants of different nationalities. This was a sophisticated commercial culture with institutions, not just a collection of people who happened to trade. Some of those merchants, when the threat became clear, may have had the resources and connections to leave. A merchant with ships and business partners in Cyprus had options that a palace labourer did not. The archaeological record at some sites shows evidence of deliberate removal of valuables before destruction, empty rooms where inventory suggests there should have been goods, storage spaces cleared before the fire. Someone took those things. Someone left with them. Not everyone was still there when the end came. The craftsmen were in a harder position. A bronzesmith or a purple dye worker, Ugarit was famous for its purple dye, made from murex shells, a luxury product traded across the Mediterranean, had skills that were valuable and portable in one sense, and completely dependent on a functioning economic context in another. Your skill at dyeing cloth purple is only useful if there are people who want purple cloth and can pay for it, and are connected to a trade network that moves the finished product to market. Strip away the trade network and the palace economy and the international merchant connections, and a master dyer is just someone who knows how to make an extremely smelly liquid from sea snails. Skills migrated, though. People carrying knowledge moved to places where the knowledge could still be used. The craftsmen of the collapsing Bronze Age world seeded the recovering societies that came after, with techniques and traditions that would be rediscovered, reimagined, and preserved. The collapse was not a hard reset. It was a brutal compression, a loss of complexity in population and organisation that nonetheless left human knowledge and human stubbornness largely intact. The people of Ugarit mostly survived. The city did not. The distinction matters more than it might seem. Egypt made it through the Bronze Age collapse. Technically, Ramesses III defeated the Sea Peoples, maintained the kingdom's borders, and kept the administrative system running long enough to claim victory. But the Egypt that emerged from the 12th century BC was not the Egypt that had gone into it. The new kingdom, the era of the great pharaohs, of Ramesses II and his colossal monuments, of the Amarna letters and the diplomatic marriages in the empire in Canaan and Nubia, was fading. Ramesses III himself was assassinated in a harem conspiracy, which tells you something about the internal stability of the kingdom, even after the external threats had been beaten back. His successors, a long series of rulers also named Ramesses, Egyptologists call them Ramesses IV through Ramesses XI, which suggests a certain lack of imagination but perhaps an abundance of family loyalty, presided over a kingdom in gradual decline. The treasury emptied. The Nubian and Levantine territories were lost. The priesthood of Amun grew powerful enough to effectively challenge royal authority. By 1069 BC, the new kingdom was over. Egypt survived, but it was changed. Let's be precise about what Egypt losing the Bronze Age world actually meant in practical terms, because it is easy to gloss over it and assume that Egypt, ancient, eternal, apparently indestructible Egypt, simply shrugged the collapse off and continued as before. It did not. The Levantine Empire was the first thing to go. Egypt had controlled a network of city-states along the coast of Canaan, modern Israel, Palestine and Lebanon for centuries, extracting tribute, stationing garrisons, appointing local governors who were answerable to the pharaoh. This empire was the source of a significant portion of Egypt's wealth. Copper from Cyprus flowing through Levantine ports, cedar from Lebanon for building and shipbuilding, grain from the fertile coastal plains, luxury goods from the wider Bronze Age trading network. Yet when the Sea Peoples disrupted the Levantine coast and the old city-states were destroyed or destabilized, Egypt's imperial revenue stream dried up. The garrisons were withdrawn or abandoned or overwhelmed. The tribute stopped coming. The Sinai, which had been Egyptian territory and the source of turquoise and copper, became harder to hold and eventually harder still. Then the internal problems compounded the external ones. The workers' strikes at Deir el-Medina, those first recorded labour actions in human history, men refusing to work because their grain rations had not arrived, were symptomatic of a state that was having difficulty meeting its basic obligations. A palace economy that cannot reliably feed its own workers is a palace economy under serious strain, The grain was late because the grain supply was disrupted. The grain supply was disrupted because the Levantine trade networks were disrupted. The Levantine networks were disrupted because the world those networks depended on was collapsing, and then Rameses III was murdered. The details of the Harem conspiracy, reconstructed from a remarkable set of legal papyri that survived from the trial of the conspirators, read like a very ancient political thriller. A secondary wife of the pharaoh, seeking to place her son on the throne, organised a plot involving palace officials, military officers, and a campaign of what appears to have been magical assassination alongside the more conventional kind. The conspirators were tried, many were executed. Some, in an unusual judicial gesture, were allowed to take their own lives. The papyri recording the trial are extraordinarily detailed. They also record indirectly the picture of a court riven by factional competition, succession anxiety, and the kind of instability that tends to emerge when a kingdom is under sustained external and internal pressure. Egypt did not fall, but standing by the end took everything it had. Among the various groups labelled as Sea Peoples in Egyptian records, one in particular stayed, settled in, dug in, and became a permanent fixture of the southern Levantine coast. The Philistines. Yes, those Philistines, the ones from the Bible. The ones whose name became an insult meaning culturally uncouth person, which is historically unkind given that the Philistines were, archaeologically speaking, a fairly sophisticated culture with distinctive pottery, urban planning, and a culinary tradition that apparently involved a surprising amount of pork, which distinguished them from their neighbours in ways both literal and metaphorical. The Philistines settled in a pentapolis, 5 cities along the coast of what is now southern Israel and the Gaza Strip: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. They maintained their own culture, their own language, their own pottery style, and their own religious traditions. They also, over the following centuries, had an extremely complicated relationship with the Israelites to their east, which is documented in considerable and sometimes dramatic detail in the Hebrew Bible, and which eventually produced the story of David and Goliath, which, even if you haven't read the rest. Here is the historical irony that tends to get lost in the weight of the word's modern meaning. The Philistines were not uncultured barbarians. The archaeological evidence from Philistine cities, particularly from Ekron and Ashkelon, which have been extensively excavated, shows a culture that was, in many respects, sophisticated and cosmopolitan. The pottery found at Philistine sites in their earliest period is distinctive and high quality, with decorative styles that connect clearly to the Aegean world the Philistines came from. These people brought their ceramic traditions with them and maintained them for generations after settling in Canaan. That's not the behaviour of a people without cultural identity or aesthetic sensibility. The food archaeology is particularly interesting. Philistine sites show a marked increase in pig bones compared to neighbouring Canaanite and Israelite sites, and the consumption of pork was, for the Philistines, simply normal. They had no dietary prohibition against it. Their neighbours increasingly did. This culinary distinction, you can track it in the trash heaps of 3,000-year-old cities, which is one of the stranger pleasures of archaeology, became one of the markers of Philistine identity, a thing that set them apart from the people they lived among and eventually conflicted with. The conflicts with the Israelites is the part of the story that most people know, if they know any of it. The Hebrew Bible portrays the Philistines as the great enemy of early Israel, as occupiers, as oppressors, as the people who captured the Ark of the Covenant and promptly suffered terrible consequences. Goliath of Gath was a Philistine. Delilah, who cut Samson's hair, may have been. The Philistine cities are described in the biblical narrative as powerful, organised, and equipped with iron weapons at a time when Israel was still using bronze, which tracks with the archaeological evidence, and also with the broader history of the Iron Age transition. What the biblical narrative understandably does not dwell on is that the Philistines, from their own perspective, were simply people who had survived a catastrophic collapse, found a place to settle, built cities, maintained their culture, and tried to secure their position in a contested and dangerous landscape. They were, in the most literal sense, refugees who became settlers, who became eventually a people whose name outlasted everything else about them. Their language is lost, their cities are archaeological sites, their gods are forgotten, but the word Philistine survives, carrying an accusation they almost certainly would not have recognised. One of history's great ironies is that the Bronze Age collapse, catastrophic as it was, may have inadvertently accelerated the transition to the next technological era, iron. Iron had been known before the collapse. The Hittites, in particular, had been working with iron for some time, and for much of the Bronze Age they maintained something approaching a monopoly on iron-working knowledge, which they protected with the kind of secrecy that today would involve NDAs and non-compete clauses. But bronze required tin, and tin required long-distance trade, and long-distance trade required stable supply chains, and stable supply chains required a functional international order, all the things that the collapse destroyed. Iron, on the other hand, could be smelted from ore that was available in many more locations. CE, you didn't need the same supply chain. You didn't need the same level of international cooperation. You just needed ore and heat and knowledge. And after the collapse, as the surviving smiths spread across the Mediterranean, ironworking spread with them. The Bronze Age ended. The Iron Age began. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because catastrophe broke the old supply chains and made new technology necessary. The transition from bronze to iron was not instantaneous, and it was not simply a matter of iron being better. In many respects, early iron was worse. Bronze, properly made, is harder than wrought iron, holds an edge better, and is easier to cast into complex shapes. The bronze sword of a Mycenaean warrior was, metallurgically speaking, a superior weapon to the early iron swords that replaced it. The reason iron won was not quality, it was accessibility. Tin, the crucial alloying component that turns copper into bronze, was geologically rare in the eastern Mediterranean and had to come from distant sources that were, by 1200 BC, unreachable for kingdoms whose trade networks had collapsed. When the tin stopped coming, the bronze stopped being made. Not all at once and not everywhere simultaneously, but gradually, persistently, across the regions most affected by the collapse. And when you cannot make bronze, you look for alternatives. Iron ore was available in places where tin was not. The Levant, Anatolia, the Greek islands, all had iron ore deposits that could be smelted with charcoal in furnaces that were, in principle, not dramatically different from the furnaces used for copper smelting. The knowledge of how to work iron had been spreading through the Hittite sphere for over a century before the collapse. When the Hittite Empire fell and its ironworking specialists dispersed, carrying their knowledge with them the way all specialists carry knowledge. In their hands and in their heads, that knowledge spread faster and further than it might otherwise have done. The early Iron Age was not technologically an improvement on the late Bronze Age. In terms of material sophistication, the quality of the goods produced, the complexity of the administrative systems, the reach of the trade networks, it was a step backward. But it was a step backward toward a more distributed, more locally self-sufficient, more resilient organisation of human society. Communities that could produce iron tools from local ore were less dependent on the long supply chains that had made the Bronze Age world so productive and so brittle. The new world was poorer and simpler. It was also harder to collapse all at once. The Iron Age eventually produced things the Bronze Age could not. Cheaper tools available to a wider population, agricultural implements that could bring heavier soils under cultivation, military equipment that could be produced at scale without access to distant tin mines. It took centuries for ironworking to mature to the point where these advantages were fully realised. But the path to them ran through the ruins of the Bronze Age, across the collapsed trade routes and out the other side. Catastrophe, as it sometimes does, cleared the ground for something new. While much of the eastern Mediterranean was still sorting through the rubble of the Bronze Age collapse, one group of people appears to have made a relatively swift and impressive recovery, and that group was the inhabitants of the Phoenician city-states along the Lebanese coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos and others, who responded to the collapse of the old trading order by essentially rebuilding it themselves on their own terms. The Phoenicians were traders. They had always been traders. Their city sat on the coast with good natural harbours and access to the famous cedars of Lebanon, the best shipbuilding timber in the Mediterranean, and when the Bronze Age palace economies that had previously organised long-distance trade collapsed, the Phoenicians did not collapse with them. They adapted. They built smaller, faster ships. They developed new trade routes. They established colonies, Carthage, most famously, across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to Sicily to North Africa to Spain. And they did one more thing, quietly, that changed history more than any of the battles or the burned palaces. They spread their alphabet. You have to understand what the Phoenicians were working with when the Bronze Age ended. Their cities had not been completely destroyed. Tyre and Sidon and Byblos survived the collapse with varying degrees of damage and disruption, reduced, pressured, their traditional trading partners gone or going, but structurally intact in ways that Ugarit and the Mycenaean palaces were not. The cedar forests were still there. The harbours were still there. The knowledge of seamanship built up over centuries of maritime trade was still there. Ye carried in the heads and hands of sailors who knew the winds and the currents and the seasonal rhythms of the Mediterranean better than anyone alive. And the Phoenicians had something else: flexibility. The Bronze Age palace economy was rigid by design, centralised, redistributive, dependent on a stable hierarchy of obligations flowing in and out of the palace complex. The Phoenician city-states were different. They were merchant cities, organised around commerce rather than around agricultural redistribution. The palace existed to support trade, not the other way around. This meant that when the larger system collapsed and took the palace economies with it, the Phoenicians had a commercial culture that could operate at smaller scale, with smaller ships, along shorter routes, with fewer trading partners and still function. They were built for adaptability in a way that Mycenae and Hittites simply were not. The ships they built in the early Iron Age were smaller than the great merchant vessels of the Bronze Age, the ones that carried tons of copper ingots and amphorae of olive oil across the open sea. But they were seaworthy, manoeuvrable, and suited to the coastal trade that remained possible when the open sea routes were too dangerous or too unprofitable. The Phoenicians hugged coastlines. They stopped at every viable harbour. They traded whatever was available wherever they found buyers, accumulating the knowledge of the Mediterranean coast with the patient thoroughness of people who understood that information about where things were and what people needed was itself a form of wealth. The colonies came later, as the recovery deepened and the range of Phoenician commerce expanded. Carthage, founded according to tradition around 814 BC on the coast of what is now Tunisia, was the most significant, eventually becoming a major power in its own right, a Phoenician daughter city that would one day field its own armies and challenge Rome and produce Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with elephants, which is the kind of thing that happens when you give ambitious merchant cultures enough time and territory. But Carthage was the culmination of a process that began modestly, with small ships and short routes, and Phoenician merchants showing up in places where no trader had been for a generation or two, and finding, reliably, that people still wanted things they didn't have. Trade finds a way. The Phoenicians found it first. Linear B died with the Mycenaean palaces. Cuneiform survived longer, but it was always a specialist tool, complex, difficult, requiring years of training, the kind of writing system that you needed a scribble class to maintain. But the alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, descended from Proto-Sinaitic script, developed in the Levant over the preceding centuries, was something different. It was simple, elegantly, revolutionarily simple. Instead of hundreds of signs representing syllables or words, the alphabet had roughly 20 to 30 signs representing individual consonants. You could learn it in weeks, not years. You could use it on papyrus, on pottery, on any surface that held a mark. You didn't need a palace scribal school to maintain it. You just needed to know the signs and have something to say. The Greeks, trading with the Phoenicians in the recovery period after the collapse, borrowed the alphabet and added vowels, creating the Greek alphabet from which the Latin alphabet descended, from which the alphabet you're reading these words in right now descended. The Bronze Age died, the alphabet lived, and with it, everything that came after. To understand why the alphabet mattered so enormously, you need to sit for a moment with how hard writing was before it. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script used across Mesopotamia and adopted for diplomatic correspondence throughout the Bronze Age, had hundreds of signs. Each sign could represent a syllable, a word, or a determinative marker indicating what category of thing the following word belonged to. Mastering it required years of dedicated study in a scribal school. The scribes who could read and write cuneiform were a specialist class, supported by palace economies, trained from childhood, and as dependent on the institutional structure of the palace for their livelihood as any soldier or craftsman. When the palaces fell, the institution that produced and sustained cuneiform literacy fell with them. Linear B, the Mycenaean script, was equally demanding. A syllabic script with around 90 signs, used almost exclusively for administrative record-keeping and understood only by palace-trained specialists. When Pylos burned and Mycenae declined, Linear B went with them. The knowledge was not preserved. It was not transmitted. It simply stopped, and the next person to read a Linear B tablet would be Michael Ventris, a British architect and amateur cryptographer who deciphered it in 1952, approximately 3,000 years after the last Mycenaean scribe put down his stylus. The Phoenician alphabet had no such institutional dependency. It had roughly 22 consonantal signs, no vowels, which makes reading it slightly effortful for the modern eye, but was apparently fine for people who knew the language and could supply the vowels from context. 22 signs. You could scratch them into a potsherd, carve them into stone, write them on papyrus with a reed brush, or stamp them into clay. You could teach them to your children without a scribal school. You could use them for a commercial transaction, a personal letter, a religious inscription, a shopping list. They were democratic in a way that cuneiform and Linear B fundamentally were not. When Greek merchants encountered Phoenician traders in the early Iron Age, on Cyprus, in the Aegean, in the harbours of the Levant, they encountered the alphabet in use and understood immediately what it could do. The Greeks adapted it with one crucial modification. They assigned some of the Phoenician consonant signs to vowel sounds, creating the first true alphabet in which both consonants and vowels were written. This innovation made the system even more transparent and learnable, and the result was a writing system of such elegant efficiency that it spread rapidly and proved essentially indestructible. The Greek alphabet became the Etruscan alphabet, which became the Latin alphabet, which became the alphabet of the Roman Empire, which became the alphabet of medieval Europe, which became the alphabet sitting quietly behind every word you have ever read. The Phoenicians did not intend to change the world. They were just trying to keep their accounts in order, but the tool they carried with them when they sailed out of the ruins of the Bronze Age turned out to be the most consequential piece of technology in human history. Historians have been arguing about what caused the Bronze Age collapse since roughly the moment historians started paying attention to the Bronze Age, and the argument, it must be said, is ongoing and genuinely fascinating, because the answer appears to be everything, not one thing, not one invasion, one drought, one earthquake, one bad harvest. All of it simultaneously feeding into each other in a cascade of compounding crises that the interconnected, complex Bronze Age system was simply not resilient enough to absorb. Eric Klein, one of the leading scholars on the collapse, calls it a perfect storm. A system's collapse triggered by multiple stresses arriving at roughly the same time. Drought, famine, internal rebellions, disruption of trade routes, migration and raiding by the sea peoples, and possibly seismic activity in some regions. No single cause, no single villain. Just a system that was too complex, too interdependent, too optimized for normal conditions, and therefore catastrophically brittle when the conditions stopped being normal. It is, if you're paying attention, a lesson that has not aged at all. The single cause explanations have each had their moment of scholarly fashion, and each has ultimately proven insufficient. For a long time, the Sea Peoples were the villain of choice, the mysterious invaders who swept down from the north and west and destroyed everything in their path. The Egyptian inscriptions seemed to support this reading, and the image of overwhelming barbarian invasion was satisfying in the way that simple explanations of complex events often are. But the archaeology complicated it. The destruction layers at different sites don't line up neatly with a single wave of invaders moving in a single direction. Some sites were destroyed multiple times. Some were abandoned without obvious evidence of violent destruction. Some show the Sea Peoples settling in the ruins of what they allegedly destroyed, which is not typical invader behaviour and suggests something more like migration than conquest. Then drought became fashionable, and the paleoclimatic data is genuinely compelling. The pollen cores and sediment records and isotope analyses do show a significant drying trend beginning around 1200 BC. But drought alone doesn't burn palaces. Drought weakens systems and stresses populations, but it takes other factors to turn stress into catastrophic collapse. Internal rebellions have been proposed, the idea that the palace economies, already under stress from drought and trade disruption, faced uprisings from the rural populations that had been supporting them, people who were hungry and no longer willing to deliver their grain to a redistributive system that was delivering less and less in return. The evidence for this is suggestive but thin, because internal rebellions are harder to document archaeologically than destructions by external enemies. Earthquakes have been proposed for specific sites. There is evidence of seismic damage at Mycenaean Tyrins around 1200 BC, Flask. But earthquakes are local events and cannot explain a collapse that was simultaneously regional. The honest answer, the one that emerges from decades of increasingly sophisticated archaeological and historical work, is that the Bronze Age collapse was an emergent phenomenon. It was not caused by any single factor, but by the interaction of multiple factors in a system complex enough that their combined effect was orders of magnitude greater than any one of them would have produced alone. The drought weakened the agricultural base. The weakened agricultural base stressed the palace economies. The stressed palace economies had fewer resources to maintain military strength and trade networks. The disrupted trade networks meant less tin and less copper and less bronze. The reduced bronze production weakened the military further. The weakened military could not protect the trade routes or resist the pressure of migrating and raiding populations. The migrating and raiding populations disrupted the remaining trade networks and put further pressure on the already stressed agricultural systems. And somewhere in that cascade, the tipping point was reached, and the system that had taken 300 years to build came apart in 50. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of humanity. It wasn't even the end of civilization, it was the end of a civilization, a specific form of palace-centered, trade-dependent Bronze Age civilization that had flourished for roughly 3 centuries. What came after was different. smaller, less connected, less sophisticated in some ways, but not nothing. People survived, communities survived, knowledge survived, some of it. Enough of it. The oral traditions that would eventually become Homer survived. The agricultural knowledge survived. The metallurgical knowledge survived and evolved and became ironworking. The alphabet survived and spread. The Phoenicians rebuilt the trade networks. The Israelites built a kingdom. The Assyrians, who'd been a significant power before the collapse and had managed to survive it with more continuity than most, began their long march toward becoming one of the most formidable military powers the ancient world had ever seen. Slowly, over the Dark Ages, the Mediterranean world found its footing again. It took centuries, but it found it. The rebuilding was not linear. It was not a smooth recovery curve moving steadily upward from the low point of the collapse toward the heights of classical civilization. It was messy and local and uneven, marked by false starts and regional variations and the kind of progress that is only visible in retrospect because it was invisible at the time. A village in Dark Age Greece that managed to maintain its population for 3 generations and then expand slightly to a second village was not experiencing what its inhabitants would have recognized as recovery. They were just trying to eat and not die. The recovery was the sum of millions of such ordinary efforts, accumulated over centuries, invisible from the inside. What carried people through the Dark Ages more than anything was knowledge. Not written knowledge. The writing was gone, or going, or locked in systems that required institutions that no longer existed. Practical knowledge. The knowledge of how to grow grain in this particular soil with these particular rains and these particular tools. The knowledge of how to work metal, how to fire pottery, how to build a boat that would not sink, how to navigate by the stars across a stretch of open water. This knowledge lived in hands and heads, transmitted through demonstration and practice, and the patient teaching of the old to the young. It was not fast. It was not efficient. It did not scale the way a palace scribal school scaled. But it was robust in a way that the palace scribal school was not, because it did not depend on the palace. The oral tradition was another form of this resilience. The stories of the Bronze Age heroes, the kings and warriors and great deeds of the world before the collapse, were preserved in song and poetry, and the elaborate mnemonics of professional storytellers, passed from generation to generation through the Dark Ages like a flame cupped in both hands against the wind. By the time Homer was composing, or the tradition that produced Homer was composing, those stories had been travelling orally for 350 years. They had been changed, elaborated, mythologized, combined with other stories and other traditions, but they had survived. The names had survived. The sense of a lost greatness had survived. And when writing came back, in the 8th century BC, the first thing the Greeks wrote down was Homer. The first thing they wanted to preserve was the memory of what had been. Civilization did not rise from the ashes of the Bronze Age fully formed. It pulled itself up slowly from very far down, as carrying what it could of what had been, building what was possible with what remained. It took 4 centuries. The result was classical Greece, and Rome, and everything that followed. Not bad for a recovery, and so here you are, 3,000 years later, lying in the dark, listening to a story about a world that ended and a world that began again in its place, and perhaps wondering, in the quiet way you wonder about things at this hour, what any of it has to do with you, more than you might think. The Bronze Age collapse is, among other things, a story about complexity and fragility, about what happens when a system becomes so interconnected, so optimized, so dependent on everything running smoothly that it loses the capacity to absorb shocks. It is a story about supply chains and their limits, about climate and its consequences, about migration and its causes, about the way that multiple manageable problems arriving simultaneously can become one unmanageable catastrophe. It is also, in a strange way, a story about resilience, about the fact that people survived, that knowledge survived, that the alphabet and the olive tree and the art of making wine and the memory of the heroes all survived and found their way into the world that came after. The Bronze Age died. You are, in a way, one of its descendants. Everything you have and know and take for granted passed through that collapse and came out the other side. Let's be honest about the parallel, because it is sitting in the room and it would be strange not to name it. You live in a world that is, in certain structural ways, more like the late Bronze Age than any other period in history. You live in a world of extraordinary interconnection, of supply chains that cross dozens of countries, of food systems that depend on stable climate and reliable logistics, of financial systems that tie the economic fate of distant nations together in ways that are efficient in good times and terrifying in bad ones. You live in a world where the tin and the copper, metaphorically and sometimes literally, come from very far away and require a great deal of international stability to keep moving. You live in a world where the letters between the great kings, the diplomatic correspondence, the trade agreements, the mutual commitments, are the thing that keeps the whole system humming along. You also live in a world experiencing climate stress. You live in a world dealing with migration driven by environmental pressure and political instability. You live in a world whose complexity has reached a level that makes it both extraordinarily productive and genuinely difficult to model. The scholars who study the Bronze Age collapse are not shy about drawing these connections. They write papers about resilience and systems theory and cascading failure that are, ostensibly, about 1200 BC and are unmistakably about the present. But here is the other thing the Bronze Age collapse tells you, the thing that is less commonly said because it is less dramatically useful. The people survived. Not all of them. Not enough of them, by any measure. The demographic catastrophe of the Dark Ages was real and terrible and should not be minimized. But human beings, as a species and as communities, turned out to be harder to finish than the palace economies that organized them. The scribes lost their writing systems and the knowledge passed into oral tradition. The traders lost their great ships and built smaller ones. The farmers lost the palace redistributive system and went back to feeding themselves. It was worse. It was much worse. But it was not the end. 3,000 years from now, if there are people 3,000 years from now, and there probably will be, because people are extraordinarily difficult to get rid of, they will study us the way we study the Bronze Age. They will find our burned layers and our abandoned cities and our records that stopped mid-sentence. They will argue about what caused our collapse and what could have been done differently, and they will note, with whatever passes for relief in their time, that people survived, that knowledge survived, that the essential stubbornness of the human animal, the refusal to simply stop, carried something forward into whatever came next. That is the comfort the Bronze Age offers if you're looking for one. Not that collapse doesn't happen, it does. Not that complexity doesn't make us fragile, it does. But that on the other side of the collapse, people kept going. They always have. They probably always will. When the world starts falling apart, the first thing people reach for is not a weapon or a grain store or a diplomatic letter. It is a prayer. The late Bronze Age was a world saturated with religious practice, with temples and offerings and priests and divine consultations and the absolute conviction that the gods were watching, yes, that the gods were involved, that the correct ritual performed at the correct time could tip the balance between survival and catastrophe. And so, as the droughts came and the harvest failed, and the letters went unanswered, and the cities on the horizon began to burn, The palaces of the Bronze Age world did what palaces always do in a crisis. They prayed harder. They offered more. They consulted the omens more frequently and with more desperation. They built temples even as the economic foundations that supported temple building were collapsing beneath them. The relationship between Bronze Age religion and Bronze Age collapse is not a simple one, but it shaped how people understood what was happening to them, and understanding is not nothing, even when the walls are on fire. The Bronze Age was not a secular world. There was no clean separation between the administrative function of the palace and its religious function, because in the ancient Near East those two things were not separable. The palace was the temple's patron, and the temple was the palace's legitimizer. The king ruled because the gods approved, or because the king was the god's earthly representative, or in the Egyptian case because the king was himself divine, at least in the official account. Every major palace had a temple or multiple temples attached to it. Every major agricultural event, planting, harvest, the flooding of rivers, was accompanied by ritual. The redistributive economy itself had a religious dimension. The offerings that flowed into the temples were stored, managed, and sometimes redistributed in ways that mirrored the palace's secular operations. Gods needed feeding just like workers did. At Ugarit, the religious literature that survives alongside the administrative tablets gives us a remarkable picture of the Bronze Age divine world. The Ugaritic pantheon was headed by El, the father of the gods, elderly, wise, somewhat remote, and Baal, the storm god, the one who brought rain, who fought chaos and death and won cyclically, in a mythological drama that mapped neatly onto the agricultural cycle of dry summers and life-giving winter rains. Baal was the god responsible for the weather. When the rains came, Baal had triumphed. When the rains did not come, and toward the end the rains increasingly did not come, the theological explanation was that Baal had lost temporarily to the forces of death and drought. The solution was ritual, more offerings, more prayer, a more elaborate ceremonial to help Baal win the cosmic battle and bring the rains back. The priests of Ugarit were performing those rituals right up to the end. The temple equipment was in place. The records of offerings were being maintained. The religious calendar was being observed. And the rains, for reasons that had nothing to do with Baal and everything to do with a multi-century climate shift, did not come back on schedule. This was not a failure of faith. It was a failure of the model, the cosmological explanation that the Bronze Age world had constructed for how weather worked and what humans could do about it. The model was wrong, in ways that no amount of ritual could correct, but there was no alternative model available, and so the rituals continued, and the drought continued, and eventually the temple burned with everything else. What survived was not the Bronze Age religious system, its elaborate rituals, its specific pantheons, its temple institutions. Those collapsed with the palaces that supported them. What survived was the human impulse that had produced them, the need to find meaning in catastrophe, to construct narratives that make suffering comprehensible, to address forces larger than yourself with something more than silence. That impulse went into the Dark Ages and came out the other side in new forms, in the religious traditions that emerged in the Iron Age, including arguably the early developments of Israelite monotheism, forged in a world where the old certainties had burned and something new was needed to stand in their place. Imagine being born in Greece in 1100 BC. You will never see a palace. You will never meet a scribe. You will never taste wine that came from a ship that sailed from Egypt, or wear cloth dyed with Phoenician purple, or handle a bronze vessel made by a craftsman who learned his trade in a palace workshop. You will grow up in a village of perhaps 200 people, in a house with a dirt floor, tending animals on land that 3 generations ago was administered by a palace official, writing everything down on clay tablets. The world your grandparents' grandparents inhabited, The world of the great palaces, the international trade, the diplomatic letters, the elaborate redistributive economy is gone so completely that you will have no name for it. You will have stories, you will have fragments of memory. Is passed down through the Dark Ages in the oral tradition the way all memory passes when there is no writing to hold it still. You will have heroes. But you will not have the world those heroes came from, and you will not fully understand what was lost because you never knew it existed. Your village is small. This is the defining fact of your world, the smallness of everything. The settlement you live in has perhaps 30 or 40 families clustered together for mutual defence and the practical advantages of shared labour. The houses are simple, oval or rectangular structures of mud brick or rough stone with thatched or flat roofs, earthen floors, a central hearth for cooking and heat. There is no drainage system. There is no storage magazine administered by palace officials. There is no scribe keeping track of how many jars of oil your family owes. There is just the village and the land around it, and the seasonal rhythm of planting and harvest that your grandparents understood and taught to your parents, and your parents have taught to you. The material world of your childhood is dramatically impoverished compared to the world that preceded it, and you have no way of knowing this, because you have nothing to compare it to. The fine Mycenaean pottery, the painted, wheel-thrown, standardized ware that archaeologists find at Bronze Age sites across the eastern Mediterranean is gone. What replaces it in the early Dark Ages is handmade, locally produced, simpler in form and decoration. Not ugly, not without craft, but modest. The person who made your family's cooking pots learned from their parents. Who learned from theirs, working at a scale and with resources available to a single village, rather than a palace workshop with specialised craftsmen and organised distribution. Bronze is rare. The long-distance trade that brought tin to the smiths has collapsed, and tin is not available locally. The bronze tools and weapons of the Bronze Age are being used until they wear out, repaired as long as possible, and then melted down and recast into smaller objects. Iron is beginning to appear. Someone has figured out how to smelt it from the local ore. But iron working is still in its early stages, and the iron tools available to your village are crude compared to what they will eventually become. You make do. Everyone makes do. Making do is the defining skill of the Dark Ages. What you have, that the Bronze Age world in all its sophistication did not quite have in the same form, is community. The village is your entire world, which means the people in it are everything. Your labour force, your safety net, your entertainment, your judges, your storytellers, your doctors, your priests. The elaborate division of labour that the palace economy supported, the specialists who did one thing and nothing else, fed by the palace redistribution, is replaced by a more generalised competence. Everyone in your village knows how to do more things. Everyone has to. This is less efficient in the economic sense. It is more resilient in the human sense, and on quiet evenings, when the work is done and the fire is burning and the village elder is telling the old stories, the stories of heroes and palaces and great ships and wars that sound almost too grand to be true, there is something there that no palace inventory ever quite captured. The Bronze Age trade network did not die cleanly. It frayed. It contracted. It rerouted around the burned cities and the abandoned ports and the sea lanes where something dangerous was happening. But it did not stop entirely, because trade, the human impulse to acquire something you don't have by exchanging something you do, does not stop. It adapts. It finds smaller vessels and shorter routes and more cautious merchants willing to take lower profits in exchange for lower risk. The Phoenician cities of the Lebanese coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, are the great example of this adaptation. They had been part of the Bronze Age trading world, been connected to the palace economies of Egypt and the Hittites and Ugarit through established commercial relationships. When those palace economies collapsed, The Phoenicians did not collapse with them. They pivoted. They built smaller ships suited to coastal trade rather than the great open sea routes. They established new relationships with whoever was still functioning, still producing, still capable of exchange. They kept moving, kept trading, kept sailing in the reduced and dangerous world of the early Iron Age until the world was ready to support something larger again. The key to understanding how trade survived the collapse is to understand the difference between the institutional trade of the Bronze Age palace system and the more personal, more flexible trade of individual merchants operating on their own account. The palace system was organised from the top down. The palace contracted with merchants, advanced them goods or silver, specified the routes, maintained the diplomatic relationships that kept the routes open, and took a share of the proceeds. It was efficient and it was organised, and it was completely dependent on the palace remaining functional. When the palace stopped functioning, that kind of trade stopped with it. But merchants had always operated on their own account as well, alongside the institutional trade. Individual traders with their own ships and their own relationships and their own commercial instincts had been working the Mediterranean routes for centuries, finding opportunities in the gaps between the official trading missions, building personal networks of trust and obligation with counterparts in distant ports. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, though the merchant families that backed them sometimes included women with significant commercial authority, were less dependent on the palace system. They needed functioning ports and reasonable safety on the sea lanes, but they did not need the full institutional apparatus of Bronze Age palace trade to do business. Some of them kept sailing through the worst of the collapse. The archaeological evidence is there, thin but real, small quantities of traded goods showing up in Dark Age contexts, the faint traces of commercial contact maintained across the disruption. A Cypriot pot in a Greek Dark Age grave, a small quantity of Levantine goods in an Italian site. The threads of connection were thin, but they were not entirely cut, and as conditions slowly stabilised, as the new political geography of the early Iron Age solidified, as the Phoenician cities found their footing, as the Greeks began cautiously expanding their maritime horizons again, those thin threads thickened into roots, and the roots into networks, and the networks into something that, by the 9th and 8th centuries BC, was beginning to look again like a Mediterranean trading world. Different from the Bronze Age version. More distributed, less palace-dependent, built on smaller ships and personal commercial relationships rather than royal contracts and diplomatic missions. But recognisably the same impulse, finding its way back to the same sea, doing what merchants always do when the conditions allow, moving things from where they are to where they are needed, and taking a fair cut for the trouble. Thus the Bronze Age collapse was not discovered by historians reading ancient texts. It was discovered by archaeologists digging in the ground layer by layer, finding the same pattern repeated at site after site across the eastern Mediterranean. A prosperous late Bronze Age occupation level, full of fine pottery and palace goods and evidence of long-distance trade connections. And then a destruction layer. Ash, burned timbers, collapsed walls, and then either nothing or something much simpler and poorer above it. The destruction layer is the collapse made physical. It is where the abstract historical narrative becomes a thing you can hold in your hand. A burned clay tablet, a melted bronze object, a storage jar full of grain that was never consumed because the people who stored it did not survive to eat it. And the archaeology of the Bronze Age collapse is one of the richest and most active fields in ancient history, precisely because the physical evidence is so abundant and so consistent and so resistant to easy explanation. The burned cities are real. The question, still genuinely open, still genuinely debated, is why they burned when they did, and all more or less at once. Archaeology works by layers. The technical term is stratigraphy, the study of how soil and material accumulate over time in distinct layers that can be read carefully, like the pages of a very slow book written in pottery shards and animal bones and collapsed architecture. When an archaeologist excavates a site with a long occupation history, they move through time as they move down into the earth. The upper layers are more recent, the lower layers older, and the transitions between layers, the moments when the character of the deposit changes significantly, mark events. A burned layer marks a fire. A gap in occupation marks abandonment. The reappearance of human material above a gap marks reoccupation, and the character of that material tells you something about who came back and what they brought with them. The Bronze Age destruction layers at sites across the eastern Mediterranean are, stratigraphically speaking, unmistakable. At Mycenae, at Tiryns, at Pylos, at Ugarit, at dozens of smaller sites across Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus and the Levant, the same pattern appears: a rich late Bronze Age level, then ash and burned material and collapsed mud brick. Yes, then either nothing for centuries, or a much impoverished early Iron Age level with simpler pottery, and no evidence of the trade connections that characterise the Bronze Age. The pottery is particularly eloquent. Mycenaean pottery, the fine, wheel-thrown, painted ware produced in palatial workshops, is one of the most useful tools in Bronze Age archaeology precisely because it is so distinctive and so widely distributed. Wherever Mycenaean trade reached, Mycenaean pottery followed. When you find it in abundance in a site's late Bronze Age level, and then find it entirely absent from the Iron Age level above, you know something significant changed. Not gradually, not slowly. The supply chain that delivered it, the ships, the merchants, the palace workshops that produced it, broke down within the span of a generation or two. And when you see that pattern at site after site, across hundreds of miles and multiple cultures and half a dozen different civilizations, you know you are looking not at a local disruption but at a systemic one. A collapse not of one palace but of the entire world those palaces had built together. There is a particular category of Bronze Age find that archaeologists call a hoard, a collection of valuable objects deliberately concealed, buried in the ground or hidden in a wall, apparently with the intention of coming back for them later. Hoards appear in the archaeological record at moments of crisis, across many cultures and many periods of history. You hide your valuables when you believe something bad is coming, and you want them to be there when the bad thing passes. The late Bronze Age is unusually rich in hoards. At site after site, yet archaeologists find collections of bronze objects, tools, weapons, ingots, personal ornaments, buried carefully, concealed deliberately, and never retrieved. The people who buried them did not come back. Whatever they were hiding from, it did not pass. The hoard sat in the ground for 3,000 years until a trowel found it, and the unretrieved hoard is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of evidence for the reality of the collapse. Somebody was scared enough to hide everything they had, and then they were gone. The Uluburn shipwreck, discovered off the coast of southern Turkey in 1982 by a sponge diver, excavated over 11 seasons of painstaking underwater archaeology, is one of the most extraordinary Bronze Age finds ever made, and it illustrates better than almost anything else just how sophisticated and interconnected the Bronze Age trading world was. The ship, which sank around 1300 BC, a century before the collapse, at the height of the Bronze Age trading world, was carrying a cargo of almost unimaginable variety and value. 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, 1 ton of tin ingots, ebony logs from Africa, hippopotamus ivory, Canaanite jewellery, Egyptian scarabs, Mycenaean pottery, Cypriot pottery, a gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, exotic resins for incense, pomegranates, a folding writing tablet, the earliest known, a wooden frame designed to hold wax for writing on. The ship itself appears to have been Canaanite, carrying goods from at least 7 different cultures, then sailing a route that connected the entire eastern Mediterranean in a single voyage. When you hold the Ulubaran cargo in your mind alongside the destruction layers of Pylos and Ugarit, the scale of what was lost in the Bronze Age collapse becomes viscerally real. The world that ship was sailing through, the world of 10-ton copper cargoes and diplomatic gold and ivory from Africa in a Canaanite hold, ceased to exist within a century of that ship going down. The routes it sailed became too dangerous or too empty to sail. The ports it served burned or emptied or both. The palace administrators who would have recorded its cargo in their careful inventories stopped writing. Everything that made that voyage possible, everything that gave it meaning, everything that explains why a single ship would be carrying goods from 7 different cultures across the open sea, all of it was gone within 100 years. The sea is still there. The ship is still there, on the bottom, under the careful custody of Turkish maritime archaeologists. The world it belonged to is not. And so, here you are, still breathing, still warm, still tucked into a bed that nobody's going to burn down tonight, in a world that, for all its noise and chaos, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being alive in the 21st century, is still standing. Think about what you just travelled through. You walked the halls of palaces that took 300 years to build and 50 years to lose. Yeah, you read the last letters of a king who had no army left and no ships left, and nothing left to do but write the truth of it on a clay tablet and wait. You watched trade networks that stretched from Afghanistan to Spain fray and snap under the weight of drought and hunger, and the slow, grinding pressure of a world that had optimized itself too perfectly for conditions that were quietly changing. You watched scribes keep their records right up until the moment the roof fell in. You watched people survive anyway. The Bronze Age world died. The people did not. They carried what they could, the stories, the skills, the alphabet, the knowledge of how to plant grain in this particular soil with these particular rains. And they walked into 400 years of darkness and came out the other side with Homer in their mouths and iron in their hands and the stubborn, unreasonable intention of building something again. That stubbornness is your inheritance. Every civilization that rose after the Bronze Age collapse, Greece, Rome, everything that followed, rose from the same soil, carried the same threads, spoke languages shaped by the same long memory. The alphabet you learned to read in was salvaged from the ruins. The stories you grew up with have Bronze Age shadows moving in them. You are, without knowing it, downstream from Ugarit, downstream from Pylos, downstream from the unnamed scribe who was still writing when the palace burned and whose tablet survived and whose words you now know. So tonight, as you let your eyes close and the weight of your own day finally releases its hold on you, maybe carry this with you into sleep, that people have survived worse, that knowledge has survived worse, that the things worth keeping have a way of being kept, passed hand to hand through the darkness until the darkness ends. The Bronze Age is over. The lights are still on. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Sleep well.